Andrew, yes, let me correct one thing. Andrew is the father of virtual argumentation theory. I'm sort of the adopted stepfather or something like that. So I do have this on a PowerPoint. So let me share screen and see if I can get this to work. Is that working? Can you see?
Yes.
Okay. So let me get started. In some ways, arguments are like chess games. That's Harvey on the right.
Thanks, Dan.
It's not a difficult analogy to elaborate. It's also an easy one to criticize. One inconvenient difference is that we're not especially surprised to hear, wow, that was a good game from chess players, even when they lose. But we are kind of surprised to hear that. We don't hear it very often, the corresponding comment, wow, that was a good argument for arguments. Of course, it's also easy to compare arguments in warfare, but I don't think I've ever heard or ever want to hear that, man. Anyone exclaim, wow, that was a good war. But sometimes we do hear this comment. Sometimes we do hear this argument about arguments. Arguments can be that good. And there's something here worth building on. Now, there's been a sea of ink spilled on the questions of what makes an argument a good one, and for that matter, what makes an argument an argument. Those are not the questions I'm really interested in today. I want to focus on the pronoun that. What does that refer to in the exclamation, wow, that was a good argument? What is this thing we're pointing to? Now, sorting out the argumentative components and the good-making components can wait. I want to just focus on the that. And let's not lose sight of the wow, because it tells us something very important, but generally overlooked about arguments. Not all good arguments are equally good. Some are better than others. Some can rise to the level of fully satisfying arguments, or even be part of the good life, what Andrew has called eudaimonistic argumentation. They can be better than just good. So the black and white vocabularies of good or bad, or valid and invalid, and to a lesser extent cogent and fallacious, aren't enough. Like chess games that elicit, wow, that was good reactions, they can still have room for improvement. They can still be better. But, spoiler alert here, you might need better players to get those better games. So I want to pair that upbeat comment, wow, that was a good argument, with a negative one, but also using that. What a disaster of an argument that was. We should never even have had it. That argument shouldn't have happened. The point is not necessarily that the argument went awry, but that the arguers shouldn't have engaged in it in the first place. Let's call these misbegotten arguments. Now, ideally, this should come as a preemptive. We should be able to see these coming and avoid them. Misbegotten arguments are rather more common than, wow, that was great arguments, but they're not all misbegotten for the same reason. There could be many reasons why we shouldn't have this argument. Might be the wrong place, not the right time, not the right issue, wrong subject. This is not something for us to argue about, or maybe we're not the right arguers for this. This isn't something for us to argue about. Isn't there something amiss about, let's say, straight, rich, white Christian males arguing to determine whether this word or that symbol is offensive to some less privileged group? I think there's something offensive about that and something wrong about it. Shouldn't have that argument. Now, just as a curiosity, can these two judgments, wow, that was a good argument, and what a misbegotten argument, ever apply to the same argument? I'm going to put this question on the back burner, but it should already be clear that I'm using the word argument in a sense which centers on arguers and their engagement. This is not the only sense of the term, of course, but neither is it especially idiosyncratic to think of arguments as events that engage arguers. It is in this sense of the term argument it's not necessarily an inappropriate ad hominem for argument appraisal to consider the arguers. Their engagement with one another takes center stage. The purely logical relations connecting their assertions moves to the side. And one final note on terminology before we really get going here is, at least initially, I'm going to take the words good and should as they appear in the post-argument comments being considered. that was good, we shouldn't have had that argument, to be part of the broad vocabulary of ethics, understood generally as value theory, rather than that of morality more narrowly as specifically the principles governing interagent behavior. The bridge connecting good arguments and what we ought to do, especially why at times we ought to argue or ought not to argue, is too large a construction project for this forum's budget. But I will say this much. For the arguments in our focus, actual events occurring in, and potentially contributing to the flourishing cognitive lives of rational agents, I am less animated by the question whether it is really objectively capital T true to save an argument that it is really objectively capital G good, and I am more interested in whether and to what extent it's justified, helpful, insightful, fruitful, or in a word, good, to describe an argument as good. For the former, validity or cogency often suffices. It's the latter that needs elaboration. So let's turn to the data. Turning to the questions at hand, what data do we have? Under what circumstances is, wow, that was a good argument, an appropriate comment? What earns the wow, and what does the pronoun that designate? If we start with the idea that arguments are mostly about inferences, we get to logical validity as the hallmark of goodness. If we start with the idea that arguments involve difference, opposition, or adversariality, we conclude that rational resolution is the summum bonum. Conversely, if we begin from the thought that good arguments establish their conclusions, we would end up with a very different sense of arguments than if we think of success as winning a competition or persuading the opposition. Rather than play both ends against the middle, hoping to find some convergence, the strategy here would be to work from the center out and back again in the hopes of reaching some equilibrium, or if not, then at least getting a better understanding of the divergence. Now, when we focus on the word that, we're confronted with all of the usual problems associated with pinning down the intended object of a demonstrative pronoun with precision. But the inscrutability of reference and the indeterminacy of ostension are just the beginning. We still have the ambiguity of the word argument to deal with. We use it for logical entailments, psychological inferences, epistemological reasoning, interpersonal confrontations, multi-party negotiations, linguistic exchanges, and a whole lot more. And all of this is even before we even get to the semantic labyrinths of the word good. So while we have to rely heavily on ordinary language methodologies, we shouldn't be surprised when they turn out to be inconclusive. If we start from the wow comment, well, that doesn't help to disambiguate that. First, the wow comment can apply to either a single person presenting an argument, arguments as extended chains of reasoning, or to multi-party dialogues. Wow could be an appropriate response. For example, when we hear someone present a sophisticated, complex, compelling, or especially clever case for a standpoint. There is some ambiguity as to whether it is the reasoning, the arguer, or the performance that's being complimented. While none of those involves the kind of argumentative engagement, which is our real target, the comment itself is evidence that the speaker has been engaged. If that is not quite the that we're after, at least it's in the right ballpark. After that, the first wave of data seems mostly negative. The reference of that in that was a good argument doesn't necessarily implicate either winning or losing, either persuasion or demonstration or resolution, and not even premises or conclusions. Who won might not have an answer. What were the premises? Might elicit a puzzled look. We'll have a little better luck with, well, what was the conclusion of that wow good argument? But that could be because any ending, even an inconclusive one, can count as a, quote, conclusion. The possibility that those standard components of arguments might be absent from what, by exclamation, if not also acclamation, are exemplary arguments is so striking that I think we need to rethink both the nature and the telos of argumentation. I mean, these wow good arguments don't necessarily involve any of those components. What we are left with as the common and salient element is the quality of the engagement. with self-reported arguer satisfaction as the prima facie and most salient measure. External third-party judgments, wow, they just had a good argument, are relevant. But since an argument whose active participants are themselves dissatisfied, automatically falls short of the kind of excellence we're after. Participant judgments are at least a good starting point. Now, there is something self-congratulatory about the comment, wow, that was a good argument, insofar as it is the arguers themselves who are responsible for the successful engagement. In the same way that win, lose, or draw, chess players who comment on what a good game they had, what game they just played, are indirectly at least praising themselves as chess players too, and themselves as well as their opponents. Third-party judgments may have greater authority than player satisfaction when it comes to chess, if it's the level of play that's at issue rather than the success of the game as a pastime or an amusement. But the transfer to argument will hit some bumps. Now, I want to bring the idea of satisfying engagement in argumentation into clearer focus. To what extent can arguer satisfaction be a workable criterion for good arguments? Now, it plays a central role in at least some evaluations, but how far can it go, and can it be enough? The clear and present danger is an untenable relativism, so it might need to be supplemented with something else. Whether we think of that as a top-down skyhook, bottoms-up scaffolding, or a tug on its own bootstraps, we need something, but it's at least a start. So let's confront the specter of relativism. And there is then a proposal on the table, and one that I believe merits serious consideration. Proposal: an argument is exemplary. Wow, good argument. If and only if all the participant arguers are satisfied. Now, I think that one half of this biconditional is definitionally true. The very best arguments will indeed satisfy everyone. Otherwise, there would be room for improvement, a better, more successful argument, a more satisfying argument. It is the converse that's interesting, and in the end, I think it falls short as a viable principle for argumentation theory. So I do not subscribe to this proposal, but I think it falls short for reasons that we might not initially expect. And when we see how it fails, it brings some important features of argumentation, I think, into greater relief, greater focus. So let me run through some objections and replies to this proposal. So the first and most obvious objection is that the principle leads to relativism and logic. It would commend an argument that is genuinely flawed by egregiously invalid inferences, but whose arguers, being too logically inept to take notice, are quite satisfied with themselves in their arguing. So that's a serious objection. Now, first, there are three responses I want to make to this objection. First, it's easy to point fingers at bad reasoners, but for all we know, that could be the situation we ourselves are in. Human reasoning can't transcend its own foibles, like our tendencies to my side and confirmation biases. It would be great if we could take a God's eye view to evaluate our own reasoning, but we can't. We can do no better than our best. And if that's not enough, well, the second thing to say, the second reply is any argument that rationally and satisfactorily delivers its participants to a conclusion or resolves their differences satisfactorily deserves to be recognized as an impressive argumentative achievement. Validity be damned, there is something praiseworthy here. And third, the objection really concerns arguers who are inept by our standards, by third-party standards. Arguers whose flawed reasoning is invisible to themselves, but not to us. My own inclination is to say that whenever we engage with an argument in order to critically evaluate it, we thereby enter into it, becoming arguers ourselves, and in this case, dissatisfied arguers. that the critics are arguers. If the critics aren't satisfied, then not all the arguers are satisfied. That's one way to preserve the proposal, if you want to go in that direction. Now, admittedly, most argumentation theorists don't take this kind of inclusive view as to who counts as an arguer. In addition to proponents and opponents, I count judges and juries, engaged spectators, targeted audiences, as well as represented proxies, kibitzers, and even for some purposes, other absent but interested parties as participants in the argument. Now, if that concept of an arguer turns out to be unworkably expansive, we can simply accept the fact that our judgments of argument quality are just that, our judgments. Different perspectives will assess things differently. As arguers, we can do no better than our best, and that is true of us as critics of arguments too. But that leads to a second objection, maybe a third too, maybe a second and a third. Arguer satisfaction as a criterion of argument goodness both relativizes and destabilizes argument quality. Two sets of evaluators can reach different evaluations, and the same evaluator can reach different judgments at different times. Some arguments that would satisfy me may not satisfy you, and arguments that once satisfied me on further reflection no longer do. But on further reflection, I can also come to appreciate the strengths of arguments that I was originally prone to dismiss. Would it be too jarring to hear someone say, that argument got better with time? Or that argument may have worked then, but I don't think so anymore. Now, I think these objections point to important and positive features rather than glitches of arguments. We cannot escape having a perspective, and we shouldn't want to waive the right to reassess things. Flying without a net is scary, but the so-called flight to objectivity, the search for a skyhook to hang the concept of a really, truly, and objectively good capital G argument, that's a merry chase. The concept of objectivity is itself within the realm of the arguable, so it can't provide the footing and escape that it promises. We need to take ownership of our arguments and our assessments of them. Nevertheless, the combination of the open-endedness of argumentation, which is one of its great features, and the heterogeneity of arguers, which is a valuable, if often challenging and even inconvenient fact of life, raises additional concerns for satisfaction as a criterion of argument goodness. Given that all we have are our own judgments, that further reflection keeps us engaged in an argument and thus keeps the argument open, and that our judgments can evolve with further reflection, we should also acknowledge that our interests, purposes, and goals can change. That is, the very criteria for what we find satisfying in an argument can change over time. The mutability of our judgments as to whether a given argument satisfies our argumentative interests and the mutability of our argumentative interests are ongoing challenges. And we know this. What starts out as an argument about, say, where to go to dinner, in which the various participants would all be satisfied by any number of reasonable options, can become, in the hands of vicious or incompetent arguers, a contest of wills in which satisfaction can only be had by winning. Or, in an unfortunately less hypothetical case, arguments about the best way to address infrastructure problems devolve into a test of political will, with all thoughts of its effects on the infrastructure relegated to the sidelines. Now, this is symptomatic, actually, of what I see as another positive aspect of argumentation. Just as arguments can always be reopened, so too can our judgments about them. The open-endedness of argumentation is the condition that lets us improve our arguments. The mutability of our judgments is the condition that lets us improve as arguers. Now, in an extreme but all too common case, we have the irresolvable situation of arguers whose goals are cannot be mutually satisfied and are resolutely immutable. They cannot both be satisfied as they are, and neither one will budge an inch. Does that mean that in this case, a good argument is impossible from the get-go, from the start? I'm afraid so. Unfortunately, this does seem to be the case. Two win-at-all-costs arguers will never produce a mutually satisfying, wow, that was good argument. But there's nothing new here. We all know this. Now, does it mean that the presence of even just a single, viciously unsatisfiable arguer completely sabotages the possibility of a, wow, that was good argument? Yeah, again, you already know that it does. What's more discouraging is the fact that the dominant adversarial model for arguments, the damn account, is a constant force pushing us to become those vicious win-at-all-costs arguers. Resolutely unsatisfiable arguers really can present an insurmountable obstacle. Having an exemplary good argument with them is just not in the cards, and it has nothing to do with the quality of the premises, the quality of the inferences, the conclusions we reach, or the responses we give to their questions and objections. You are never going to have a wow good argument with a willful argument troll. Evaluating our argumentative engagements sometimes need to focus less on how satisfying the argument's illative core and dialectical tier are, and focus more on how satisfiable the argument's arguers are. Now, so although the proposal, I think, the proposal that arguer satisfaction can be a criterion for good argumentation, can withstand these objections. There's a variation on the first objection that I want to raise because I think it really does undermine the proposal. Ironically, the objection is not from logic or epistemology, but ethics. So let me explain. The first counterexample to using satisfied arguers as indicators of satisfactory arguments involved astute critics rendering a negative judgment on the logic of obtuse arguers. And part of that response was that when those critics engage with the arguer's reasoning, as well as their objections and replies in order to evaluate them, they enter into the argument. They engage with the argument and they become arguers themselves. In this case, dissatisfied arguers. But let's change the nature of the critic's judgment from a negative one concerning their logic to a negative judgment on the arguer's conduct, their argumentation ethics. And in that case, the reply that they become arguers no longer works. So here's the ethical objection. If we witness abusive arguers, we do not have to examine their reasoning to ground a negative judgment, regardless of arguer satisfaction. If we see argumentative injustice, for example, the systematic exclusion of marginalized voices or and standpoints, we already have prima facie grounds for criticism without having to work through the premises and inferences. And if for some observable and relevant reason an argument is misbegotten, we would also be in a position to not deny that it could be a wow good argument without engaging, even if the arguers themselves are satisfied. Simply put, ethical argumentation cannot be exemplary argumentation, and this trumps arguer satisfaction. Now, I want to illustrate this by what I call shuffling the argumentative deck. It's a thought experiment. So, if arguers matter when it comes to argument evaluation, redistributing the component speech acts to different arguers could change our appraisal of an argument. Okay, this sort of immediately follows. As a follow-up to that idea, imagine that we have a transcript of a multi-party argument, or a deliberation, or a negotiation, or a critical discussion. It could even be a presented paper like this one, followed by a Q&A session. It includes all the things that the participants say, their assertions, their objections, their questions, etc. Now, redistribute those speech acts to different participants in the argument. So you have the same speech acts, just different people talking. Can that affect the quality of the argument? Can it change the appraisal? Now, when I've posed this question, this thought experiment in other contexts, It's acted like something of a Rorschach test, an inkblot test for argumentation theorists. Theorists who come to the field from logic immediately want to say, no, the quality of the argument doesn't change because the quality of reasoning is independent of the reasoner. Theorists who see arguments as interagent interactions embedded in a complex social dynamics determined by factors like race, class, and gender tend to go the other way. Theorists whose roots are in epistemology or philosophy of language split down the middle. Standpoint and speech act theories have the resources to recognize that the same words uttered by different speakers can carry different weights or even mean different things entirely. But the idea that propositional content can be abstracted away from context for thought and speech acts is common. Here are two ways that who is speaking can make a very dramatic difference. The first is provided by considering the arguer's standing, their position, their role in the argument. Consider the words, "This case is completely without merit." If it's said by the judge in the course of legal argumentation, they carry a lot of weight. The same words from the defendant in a civil lawsuit? Not so much. Input from kibitzers, spectators, and trolls can generally be dismissed with impunity. Standing matters. A second sort of difference, and no less dramatic, comes from speaker identity. Notoriously, there are racial, ethnic, and sexual terms which would be slurs coming from me, but could even be terms of endearment coming from someone within the targeted groups. For example, I, as a Jew, can ask a co-religionist, "Was macht der Yid?" A traditional Yiddish greeting that functions roughly as "how you doing," but translates literally as "what does a Jew make?" The use of Yid here would be slightly offensive coming from a Gentile. Now, this is admittedly a very mild case, and the offensiveness of other terms is much higher, much more contentious, and much more problematic. So let's raise the stakes. Let's consider a debate about, say, Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement. Would it matter if all the participants in the argument are straight white Christian males? And the argument about Black Lives Matter. Well, would it matter? Yes and no. So we need to look more closely at such a debate. So I'm going to go to one in particular that recently up here in Maine. Suppose we have the transcript of a town forum, an open forum in a small town hall meeting in rural Maine. Skowhegan's the town, by the way, called to discuss whether Indians is a neutral and purely descriptive term, or whether it is somehow pejorative, somehow offensive, and therefore unsuitable as the name for the high school sports teams. You can imagine passions run high, appeals to tradition are met with idealizations of progress, resentment against political correctness are answered with considerations of respect. Now, suppose you are given the further information that although the crowd is relatively diverse by rural Maine standards, everyone who spoke was a straight white Christian adult male. None of the women, children, African Americans, or most relevantly, members of the Micmac, Passamaquoddy, or Penobscot nations who were present contributed anything. Now, even if that distribution came about by pure chance, rather than by deliberate exclusion, systematic socialization, or personal choices, questions about perspective and perspective blindness absolutely need to be raised. And so do questions about standing. Isn't there something just at least a little bit ridiculous, as well as a wee bit offensive, about a group of white men deciding whether the term Indian in this particular context is offensive to the people in the Wabanaki Confederation? Even if, in the end, they are all quite satisfied with themselves in their argumentation, it's not their call. Satisfying, perhaps, but I think a bit misbegotten. So, this time we shuffle the deck. And this time, when we shuffle the argumentative deck, we want to redistribute the lines to people who didn't speak. So A, B, C, D through H give way to Z through S, a whole new set of speakers. Same script, but an entirely different cast of characters. Does that change how we critically evaluate the argument? Well, if the reasoning is fallacious the first time around, it still is. And if it wasn't, it still isn't. But at least the bad taste of the argument being misbegotten has been eliminated. But wait, suppose we learn now that the information we were given about only straight white Christian males speaking was false. It was actually misinformation from a troll. It was in fact just a bad April Fool's joke. In fact, the speakers were representative of all the relevant perspectives, except straight white Christian males. What should we say now? What should we say? Well, the first thing to say is that now we actually have to undertake the hard work of critically engaging with the argument itself. That includes the logic of the inferences, the rhetorical presentation, the quality of the objections, the cogency of the replies, and perhaps also supporting lines of reasoning that weren't presented and the trenchant objections that weren't raised. But we also have to consider the engagement and satisfaction levels of the participants. The arguments of the uninterested, inattentive, insincere, or unwilling arguers are not examples of argumentation at its best. The problem of vicious arguers is pernicious. Now, the other thing to note about this is that the same level of critical scrutiny applies to both arguments, the one with only straight white Christian males talking and the other with no straight white Christian males talking. Presumably, if the propositional contents and illocutionary forces of the speaker's remarks are the same, not as I noted above a certainty, but it's certainly a possibility given the identity of the words, the critical evaluations would end up the same. Even so, a crucial and critical difference remains. So do they get the same critical evaluations? Perhaps, perhaps not. But a critical difference remains. Since the first was susceptible to prima facie criticism regarding standpoint and standing, if those arguers cannot really know the situation, and I can't know what it's like to be a Native American in Skowhegan, Central Maine, epistemological blind spot on my part, or something like that. Then the two otherwise identical arguments call for different critical responses. What I mean by that is any critic who doesn't raise the identity question, seeing a bunch of old white Christian males talking about school mascots, would be remiss. That's something a critic should at least flag. Even if at the end they come to the same evaluation, if you don't raise that issue, you're negligent as an argumentation critic. You have failed in your response in your appraisal. So while this isn't necessarily a problem reflecting a lack of argumentative virtue on the part of the arguers, maybe all those white guys are quite virtuous arguers, it does require an external ethical perspective. And it does present some challenges for traditional argument analysis, because we've put our finger on an important prima facie difference. Even if our critical evaluations are the same, the critical responses should not be. Now, of course, that external perspective is itself arguable. So while the specter of relativism confined to individual arguments evaporates, we can never entirely escape the realm of the arguer, the realm of the arguable. To put a more positive spin on it, we're not going to run out of things to argue about, because even if all our arguments about things are settled, we can still argue about the arguments. So let me just sum up what I've said. There are an untold number of variations on how you can shuffle the argumentative deck. I've only looked at a couple here. I think this thought experiment can be put to use in arguing for a wide variety of conclusions. So I really want to draw the very modest conclusions. First, that arguers matter in argument appraisal. And while their satisfaction is an important factor in that project, it's not enough. So those are the modest conclusions. There are also some less modest corollaries that I reached along the way. Some good arguments are better than other good arguments. Bad arguers can undermine arguments, prevent good arguments. Good arguers, while not sufficient, are necessary for the very best arguments. And good arguments aren't always possible. For that, you need good arguers. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this. The sense of argument that I've been using and the kinds of arguments that I think argumentation theorists ought most concern themselves with should be adjusted accordingly. Arguers, their engagement, and their satisfaction need to be, if not foregrounded, at least not completely eclipsed by inference persuasion and the resolution of differences. They need to be pulled out from the shadows. Or, if I may be allowed to end a presentation with a preposition, then the proposition I would leave you with is this. The arguers that matter to us are the arguments that we, as arguers, matter to. Thank you.